you, Isabel. Well, the name of the presentation is up there. It's the investigations that I'll be talking about are principally what we call end-state investigations. How can we perhaps solve the problem, not just at Collingwood but at all beaches, over a planning time frame? And also, perhaps if we don't go that far, how might we develop adaptive solutions that reduce the risk but perhaps are more achievable? Isabel, to advance the slides. Okay, I work for a company called Royal Huskisson. We recently merged with another crowd called DHV. That's what RHDHV is. Huskisson Australia is quite new in here. We've only been going for 2.5 years. We're based in the Netherlands and the UK. In Sydney, we're a group of about 30 coastal and maritime engineers, and we've recently opened offices in Newcastle and on the Gold Coast. There is an experienced client group, mainly ex-Patterson Britton and Partners, ex-Worley Parsons and SMEC, and I'm sure you would have heard of some of those groups. I'm a civil engineer. I have postgraduate qualifications in coastal and maritime, and I've been working in this area for about 30 years. In a former life, I did some work for Bob and have been around Collingwood Beach a little bit, as well as other beaches in the Shoalhaven. Just in terms of the talk outline today, I propose to run through those matters. We'll talk a little bit about history of coastal development, a bit of the storm history. I'll touch on the Coastal Zone Management Plan investigations. I don't propose to go into any detail there. Just recap on Council's coastal development controls as they apply today. Then talk a little bit about more recent citywide investigations that Council has been busy with. And then I'll be talking about what Council does in storm situations and emergency situations, what it might be able to do over the longer term to try and solve the problem once and for all. You'll see that these are prohibitively expensive options. And then is there anything we might be able to do in the middle of those two? That's getting into these transitional schemes. And the transitional schemes really are quite broad concepts at this stage, and it's about just flagging those and saying, well, is it worth actually exploring some of those a little bit further? And that's sort of covered off in that last point. And those various bullet points we'll have those at the top of the screen. So Collingwood Beach, old photo, 1944, 2001. Have a broad look at that lot, and you'd say not much has happened at Collingwood, certainly on the coastline over the last 70 years, but certainly a lot of development has happened. Some of the early shots from the community that have been passed on to Ray, a view looking north along Collingwood Beach, and just a view of the levelling of the dunes. And that was a subdivision sort of going in about 50 years ago. The levelling of the dunes is of particular interest because the dunes really are part of the beach system, as we all know. And levelling dunes, building on dunes, there's little surprise that the beach might want to get back into those dunes in its storm activity. Some of the storm history, a photograph that's been reflected in a few, I think, of Council's documents. 1974 storms. The inset photo was taken in 75, so that's a 74 shot of the beach and 75 of the erosion, probably in the central and southern areas of the beach, and that was in an early SMEC draft. Another early shot, Davies, 1982, storm damage, southern end of Collingwood Beach. 1977, there were, decent storms in 74, and then 77, 78, it's fair to say since the mid-80s or so, storms have been quite muted. Nonetheless, in July 2013, there's another shot of erosion on the beach. a little bit about the Coastal Zone Management Plan investigations. The main ones I'll just refer to are the SMEC work done in the mid-2000s, and then later in 2009-10, after the sea level rise benchmarks were brought in and then also withdrawn, and then talk a little bit about UMWEL's Coastal Zone Management Plan draft. What SMEC essentially did was just describe the hazard on the beach, and I'll just recap on the work that they did in quite simple terms so that we can try and just explain what was done. And I'll talk to these sort of key points: what a storm cut is and how that differs from long-term changes. Talk a little bit about inundation, what that is, and then the mapping of the hazard lines, which is of interest. So firstly, storm cut. I really won't be putting up a whole lot of science kind of type slides, but a quick slide. It's of interest to see that there is information on a relationship between return interval or frequency of occurrence, if you like, and wave height. This is data which is measured at the Wave Rider buoy off Port Kembla. And for example, what it might say is once every 10 years, we might have a storm which lasts an hour, producing significant wave heights of 7 metres. Okay? Once every 10 years, we might have a wave height that lasts for 24 hours of about 5.2 metres. So if we're looking at a shorter period storm, what we can find is we can actually get larger wave heights in that storm for given recurrence intervals. And it's normally in the 50 to 100 year recurrence intervals that are of interest to us in terms of defining hazard at a beach and also hazard management options. So we're looking at offshore wave heights in the sort of 7 to 8.5 metre range. What was done previously was some modelling was done looking at how waves from offshore penetrate into Collingwood Beach, and what we've got written on there are actually the wave transformation coefficients, which is really just the ratio of the wave inshore versus the wave offshore. So at that area there, the wave heights would have been about 70% of the wave heights at their offshore point, wherever that was when they did this work. So, and that just shows how the arrow directions show the direction of the wave orthogonal, which is also of interest. If we just have a look at, say, storm cut, what happens in a storm is the beach gets eroded. If we take a slice through that, and let's say that slice was 1 metre wide, 1 metre travelling along the length of the shoreline, in that slice, in a design storm, it's predicted that 110 cubic metres of material would be in that slice. Now that is developed from aerial photogrammetry. It's also developed from survey, and what it's calibrated against photographs and also calibrated against some numerical modelling. So the best information we have at this point is that a design storm, a 100-year storm, could potentially erode 110 cubic metres per metre from the beach. What's also of interest is the slope at the back of that cut, because that affects the stability of the ground immediately behind that, and also that translates to the stability of the foundations further landward. I'll just run through a small animation here just to help us understand that. This is a situation perhaps before a storm happens. We might then have a storm where the water level gets up, it's high tide, there's wave penetration to the site as per that earlier slide that I showed. And then what happens is, like that last slide, we might get some erosion happening at the beach. When that erosion happens, you actually get a very steep face at the back of the beach, vertical or subvertical, and it's this area here that might be around about 110 cubic metres per metre. That 110 is actually measured above mean sea level, so wherever mean sea level is, that's a measure of that cut. Then the storm withdraws and the backscarp dries out. And when the backscarp dries out, it flattens. It's not stable there. If you go to the beach and the tide washes up, you dig a hole. When the sand's wet, you can get a nice steep side to that hole. As soon as it dries out, it wants to flatten out. And that's what that is referring to. Now, you guys would have seen this wedge failure plane model. It was developed by a colleague of mine, Lex Nielsen. It's found its way into some of the coastal hazard definition work that's been done for council, and it's also adopted more broadly on the coast by the Office of Environment and Heritage. And what it does is it just simply relates some of those things I was just explaining to you to areas behind here that have different factors of safety, and I'll explain that in a minute. Firstly, this zone up here, which is the zone which is slumped, is called the zone of slope adjustment. So that zone simply just falls into that wedge down at the bottom. This area over here is called the zone of reduced foundation capacity, and I'll explain that further in a minute. And that there is called the stable foundation zone. I mean, ideally this is where we would like property to be, because it's going to be stable. If we get into some of those other areas, we've got other issues that we need to concern ourselves with. Just having a look at some of these descriptors and what it might mean in terms of factors of safety. All a factor of safety is a ratio of the stabilising force to the activating force. So here, clearly, the stabilising force is less than the activating force, so that ratio is less than 1. Here it's between 1 and 1.5. Here it's greater than 1.5. If our stabilising forces are more than 50% of our activating forces, we're in an area which is, for engineers, is considered acceptably stable, and that's in this green zone. So houses there, we'd prefer them to be. Houses over there, we would prefer them not to be. In the middle, also not to be. Unless one provides deeper foundations into the stable foundation zone, then that is generally considered to be acceptable. The lines that Council has mapped are zone of reduced foundation capacity lines. You would have seen that in some of the mapping. That simply is that point there on the model. That's called the zone of reduced foundation capacity. It's been defined as the zone of foundation capacity line on the landward edge of that zone. Now, after the storm, what happens is we get swell waves, we're back to fair weather condition, and some sand is brought back onto the beach, and the beach builds up. Now, the beach typically, and at Collingwood to some extent, doesn't quite build up to where it was before. There's a small leakage of sand, and that leakage contributes to what's called budget recession. Now, in a planned sense, what budget recession actually means is that sand, which was eroded from the beach, tends to get lost from the compartment. Some of that sand might move into deeper water, might be sucked out in a rip, and so lost effectively from the system. Some of the sand might move around the headlands. Some of the sand, in fact, might be blown on shore, and some of the sand might go into, say, Moona Creek. Now, it's fair to say that these losses are quite small at Collingwood. But just to give you a sense as to what that might mean, over time, as these losses do occur, the profile essentially moves landward to the point where the buffer is reduced. Now, under sea level rise, in simplistic terms, the buffer is reduced even further. So that there is the concept description of long-term recession due to budget losses and sea level rise. If we talk a little bit about inundation, in simple terms, Christmas tides, we all know they get up pretty high. Sea level rise and Christmas tides possibly get up even higher, and that then might lead to, when we have storms, possibly waves overtopping those storms and the water inundating onto coastal property. That is the most current map of coastal hazard lines, developed in about 2010 based on the 2006 work, but incorporating the most up-to-date sea level rise information. And what we have mapped here is we have 2100 zone of reduced foundation capacity, that as per that definition you saw a minute ago, 2050, 2025, and also immediate. And immediate, I guess, is of particular interest because all that means is that we are simply taking from that beach the 110 cubic metres per metre, slumping it at the back, and establishing where that zone of reduced foundation capacity is, and that line is that red line. That there is a 50-year example. We might have 50 years of recession due to compartment losses and sea level rise effect, erosion from a design storm. Now the design storm is taken to be a 100-year storm, 100-year recurrence interval storm for all of those particular events. So we take the 110 off, we go to our map line is the orange line. Just jumping onto Council's development controls, DCP, interim policy areas of coastal management, currently applies and will do so until draft DCP 118 is reviewed and adopted by Council. In a nutshell, what areas of coastal management tells us is that we have different risk zones which are defined between these zone of reduced foundation capacity lines. The high risk zone is a zone where no new development is permitted, but where minor alterations and fit outs can occur. The moderate risk zone, in that zone, proposals to address standard criteria for coastal instability are required. So any proposal that's submitted to Council needs to consider those. If that particular proposal is landed at the 2050 line, generally Council doesn't require any additional coastal engineering investigation. Nonetheless, any buildings in that zone do need to have foundations that penetrate the 2100 zone of reduced foundation capacity line. And by that, all I mean is that your foundations need to get into that green zone. So just recent citywide investigations and work strategies that Council's been busy with. Council has 10 exposed beaches where property is particularly a threat. And they are from Shoalhaven Heads down to Collingwood Beach in the south. Collingwood Beach is but one of the 10. It's fair to say it's one of the more exposed, but it is but one of 10 beaches that Council is concerned with. The more recent investigations that Council has been busy with on a citywide basis are those asset risk management work done by BMT WBM in 2012, some Sydney Uni work on beach vulnerability, beach scraping advice and application, dredging feasibility work. Spurway and Associates recently produced a final document for Council, and Council is busy at the moment with some sea level rise work on the south coast, trying to understand any regional influences. And that's a joint project with Eurobodalla Shire Council. I'll talk about each of those in turn. Just number one, this was a risk review. It rated low, medium and high level and extreme risks. 6 extreme and high level risk assets were identified for Collingwood Beach. Pump station, sewer rising main, cycleway, Ilfracombe Avenue, water supply. Those were assets, I think, which were in that high risk and extreme risk category. About $3 million worth of public assets were in that category. The Sydney University work, this is a little bit more, I guess, difficult to follow and understand. It's quite esoteric work. It examined the relative vulnerability to sea level rise of I think it was 8 exposed beaches in the Shoalhaven. Previously we saw 10. I think Narrawali and Kalala Bay were removed from that investigation by Sydney Uni. And what vulnerability is a measure of how changes can harm a system. So that's what they were looking at. What they found was that Mollymook and Collingwood were the most vulnerable beaches of all of the beaches in the Shoalhaven. Just having a look at some of my notes here on this slide. Don't worry, it's okay. Can't find it. It's okay. What Collingwood actually was found to have a relatively high adaptive capacity, and by that I think the researchers were saying the age demographic and the income profile of that beach actually meant that residents at that beach were more adaptive and could adapt to a higher extent than perhaps residents at other beaches. So yeah, I'd really refer you to the report if you wanted to know more about that. Nonetheless, Collingwood was one of the most vulnerable in the Shoalhaven. Beach scraping advice. What beach scraping is a technique for accelerating beach recovery following erosion. It's basically doing what nature would do anyway. It's taking sand which has been washed away from the back of the beach into the swash zone and pushing that sand back to the back of the beach. What it does is it allows the energy of the sea to bring additional sand onshore quicker, which it just speeds up the rebuilding process. Nonetheless, it's a very short-term benefit. We see it as mainly an amenity benefit rather than a protective benefit. This is an example of a beach scraping exercise at Kalala Bay in 2003. Here's the work done in 2003. It's implemented there at a cost of around about $150 a metre. 2 years later, it's all washed away. So you would say, was that worth it? And I'll leave that up to you to decide. I mean, there was clearly an amenity benefit. It was unfortunate that the storm arrived as quickly as it did. So it's certainly not a panacea. It's not going to help protect your property even in a moderate storm. But if you have a hiatus of storms and you don't have any, then clearly you've got a better amenity. Dredging feasibility study by Spurway and Associates. What it did, it looked at strategies to deal with demands for improved navigation. That was the basis of that work. And it targeted clean deposits at estuaries, estuary entrances, and also at boat ramps. What it found was that at boat ramps, potentially there could be about 5,000 to 10,000 cubic metres of sand, which could be cleared from those boat ramps, and that sand might be available to perhaps do something on beaches to protect beaches. In a larger sense, say, such as, for example, at Lake Majala, where we have very large entrance shoals, potentially sort of 50 to 70,000 cubic metres of sand might be available there. At Currumbin Creek, we might be looking at something in between those numbers. I'd refer you to that report, which is on the website, if you wanted more information on that. The fifth and last study that Council's still busy with is a South Coast Regional Sea Level Rise Planning and Policy Response Framework. That's what it's called, the jargon. It's a joint Shoalhaven-Eurobodalla project, and it's to inform coastal planning within these two LGAs. All I've done here is taken one of the figures from the draft report, which shows the measured water level at Fort Denison from 1880 to 2010 or 2015 to current fact. And what we can see here is we can see it's been a little bit all over the place, but we see a general trend of increase in water level. And I think what's, I guess, particularly concerning to scientists is the increasing rate of increase in recent times. What I should also add is that in about 1930 or thereabout, there was a datum shift at Fort Denison, and there's a little bit of uncertainty as to how you compare perhaps numbers on this side of 1930 on that side of 1930. But nonetheless, it doesn't affect what we see from there. Over the last 20 or 30 years, say 20 years, from about 1990, at Fort Denison, water levels have been rising at about 4 millimetres a year. And when we do our coastal hazard assessments now, we actually have to take that 4 millimetres per year into account when we interpret long-term recession. So that's just data, that's hard facts, what's been measured. The predictions are of more sort of scientific interest at this point, and that is where does this trajectory maybe go from here. Those there are the benchmarks, which were issued in 2009, I think it was, by the state government. They were then withdrawn on the basis of advice from the chief scientist. Councils, unfortunately, were left with, with the baby, and they had to make their own decisions. And all the advice that council has been getting to this point is you really can't be moving away from that. So that's kind of council's bind at the moment. And I think this particular investigation is going to that very thing, trying to understand, council wants to understand what is actually happening in a regional sense on the coast here. So some of these make safe, make good policies. This is all about what council does after a small storm, right? We're talking here about storms that might be up to 2 or 3 year average recurrence interval storms. Council has in place some emergency provisions and plans. It's got a coastal emergency sub-plan for all of its key beaches, including Collingwood, and they also have an asset management plan for coastal and estuary assets, which is a separate internal document that Council has. And these plans allow Council to implement these sorts of provisions, to temporarily close damaged access ways, to reshape the beach at essential access ways. And what Council, I think, is wanting to do at a number of its beaches is it wants to rationalise the number of access ways that exist, particularly private access ways. When you've got a private access way that gets damaged in a storm, clearly it's not a high priority access way for Council to go back and reshape. It'll go to the public access ways before it goes to the private access ways. But that, I think, is quite a maintenance bind for Council, which they might want to talk to afterwards. Some of the other things that Council does in an emergency sense, clearly it's monitoring things and it's implementing beach scraping as necessary. At Collingwood Beach, SMEC in 2011 identifies nearly all beachfront property at the beach as exposed to coastal inundation during a design storm. Now, a design storm, we're talking about a 100-year storm. The last time we had a 100-year storm was in 1974. Now, you'd say, was that a 100-year storm? Who knows? Maybe it was a 50-year storm. Anyway, it was a very big storm. When we see these red areas versus the green areas, what does that mean? What that means is that these red areas here are predicted to experience overtopping, which is water coming over the dune and possibly and washing landward. These green areas here won't until after the design erosion has in fact happened. Because when the design erosion occurs, what happens is the dune crest gets lost to that erosion. So you're actually left with a lower crest, and any design waves that might still be around at the end of that storm event have the potential of washing into those green areas. So clearly these green areas are at much lower risk than the red areas. Nonetheless, they're both worth showing. The emergency response actions in the sub-plan refer to using nourishment and scrapings prior to storms to enhance dune volumes and to raise dune crest levels. Now, I guess we would say, beach scraping, okay, maybe that could be done, but we wouldn't say that it's appropriate to be describing nourishment as an activity which really is a make safe, make good activity. For any nourishment to take place, there really are extensive investigations that are required to underpin any nourishment work. So it's not clear to us how nourishment really could be a make safe, make good provision. Nonetheless, we'll talk about nourishment a little bit more as to how it could be applied. Right, end state work. So what this is all about what can we do as engineers to protect Collingwood Beach based on the hazard descriptions which have been developed by SMAC and presented in the Coastal Zone Management Plan. So that really is our brief. And we tackled that as best we could. The beach is an authorised location under the Coastal Protection Act. What that means is it's a recognised hotspot. It's one of How many beaches? Maybe 20 or so beaches, maybe a few less, I'm not sure, which are designated as hotspot beaches up and down the coast. Emergency provisions under the Stage 1 reforms of the Coastal Protection Act apply at these hotspot beaches. As far as we're concerned, and I think perhaps as far as Council is concerned, these emergency provisions are essentially unworkable. What they say you can do is they say you can go there, fill some geotextile containers, relatively small geotextile containers with sand. You don't dig them in too far. You don't build the crests up too high. You get an engineer to sign off on whatever's proposed, and then you can leave them there for a year while you go and get a DA for a proper wall, a fully designed wall. And then after a year you've got to pull it out, otherwise you might be exposed to some recourse from the council. Private property owners implementing their own walls has been tried at Albar recently, and that was refused by the New South Wales Coastal Panel. I can talk to you about that afterwards if you like. But there are all sorts of issues in trying to develop a wall for your property, or perhaps for yours and your neighbours, because of the edge effects. You really need to deal with these things on beach-wide bases, or at least on substantial compartment bases. Otherwise, they really are unworkable. We investigated these end-state works in 2013, and as I said, an end-state work is designed to deliver protection from coastal hazards over a 50 to 100 year life, over a property design life, whatever we might want to select for that design life. When we initiated our work, one thing we wanted to do is we wanted to have a look and see if we could find any resistant material to erosion on the beach. We didn't have an enormous budget. We had to go to 3 beaches. At Collingwood, we picked a couple of locations along the beach. We drove in these rods. We drove them 4 metres into the sand, and at each of the locations that we drove them into the sand, which was here and here, we didn't pull up on anything that we would call erosion-resistant material. This here is a measure of level in AHD versus the number of blows number of hammer blows that you drop onto the top of that rod, and the number of blows to get you 100 millimetres of penetration is plotted against level. So when we get into the sand, as that rod actually penetrates the sand, you can see it takes a greater number of blows to get your 100 millimetres of penetration. Numbers of around about 40 blows per 100 millimetres is considered to be refusal, and we weren't getting there clearly. So we were getting 4 metres of penetration from a spot which might have been just above the water line on the day, without any real sense of resistance. And what that means is that we really need to be treating this whole profile as potentially an erodable profile based on this limited scope of work. I mean, you might want to go over here, you might want to go over here, and it's fair enough that we go all over the beach if we want to firm up on these things. What we did with our work is we divided the beach into 3 precincts. These were just based on relative exposure, relative risk, and picking key streets to help us with this. Ilfracombe Avenue, north of Albion Street, was deserving of its own precinct. This area here was relatively protected, and this area here was relatively exposed. The hazard summary from SMEC, I've been through some of these things already. 110 cubic metres per metre. The sediment budget recessions are small on the beach, up to 0.13 of a metre per year. So that's the leakage effect that I was talking about earlier. I think there are areas down here where it's 0, and areas up there where it's also 0. So those areas, I think, are more manifest in the middle of the beach. The sea level rise recession effects are based on the best technologies that we have at this point, which is called the Bruin rule, and they're also based on the benchmark numbers, which Council is now going back and having another look at. Some of the wave run-up levels, 5 to 5.5 metres above Australian height datum. That's pretty close to what you have on top of the dune there now. The 3 precincts at risk, we had clearly properties, cycleways, sewage, water mains, roadways. 54 residences at immediate zone of reduced foundation capacity risk. And that's simply going back to the air photo showing those lines. More than 100 properties at risk by 2050. And that's at risk from reduced foundation capacity. Not at risk from actually having the sand washed from underneath you, but from being at that zone of reduced foundation capacity zone. More than 100 residents at risk from inundation in a 100-year storm occurring today. So, what can we do to try and mitigate these risks? We looked at revetments, beach nourishment, and also near-shore breakwaters. What revetments are is they're short parallel structures. They physically interrupt the wave action. And what they have the effect of doing is they have the effect of moving a hazard line basically to the crest of the revetment. So that's a slice through the beach, through the dune. That's typically what a revetment might look like. The top of the dune might be back here, the hazard line might be back here, close to the houses. If that revetment is constructed, in effect, you move the hazard line from there to there, as long as that's in place and functioning. We separately looked at those for each precinct, developed that design based on a breaking wave height of 2.3 metres, which we got from the 2006 work. Concept design involves 1 to 2 tonne rock over an underlay. Often you see a bit of a toe in front of these structures because the beach is relatively protected. That's a relatively small breaking wave height. We believe that that might not be needed at this site. Test level 4.5 to 5. To build that is about $10,000 per linear metre. Beach nourishment, that's putting new sand on the beach to feed the ongoing erosion. We characterised how much sand might be lost in a storm, how much sand might be lost due to long-term recession. If you keep putting sand on the beach to feed the recession and feed the storm, essentially you can hold the shoreline in the same position. That's all beach nourishment is. You can imagine that for 50 years of protection, that amounts to a lot of sand. And I'll talk a little bit more about what quantities are involved. 3 nourishment scenarios we looked at. We looked at what we call massive nourishment. Nourishment with the groin near Susan Street, which allows us to compartmentalise an area of nourishment and not focus on areas which are relatively protected. And then amenity nourishment, which is basically protecting the beach more so than protecting property, but I'll talk about that as well. So going to massive nourishment. Massive nourishment does the job of a full-length revetment. It needs an initial placement of sand plus ongoing maintenance placements. And you'll see that we're talking about very large quantities of sand. And it's not just about putting sand on the beach, because if you put sand on the beach, that sand very rapidly gets washed into the swash zone and beyond. We need to actually get that sand out to a depth which is called the depth of closure for a beach. And that's characterised here. The depth of closure at Collingwood Beach is around about -7 metres below mean sea level. So what you will find is in a very large storm, that storm will actually be moving sediment around down in the bed here. It won't be moving sediment around over here. So that, if you like, is the compartment within which sediment might move. So, in effect, the best way that you can nourish a beach is not just to put it over there, but put it over the whole profile. Now, what you will see is that 60% of the sand that you need for nourishment is actually, you don't see. It's underneath the water. This is the depth that you see. And at Collingwood, a massive nourishment project, we would say, requires a 10-metre widening of the dune, and sand placed all the way up to -7, and there are techniques for doing this, and you would need 250,000 cubic metres of sand. Now, that's a lot of sand. So inside this room we might have, what have we got, like 10 by 8, that's 80 by 3, 200, say 200 cubic metres, 250,000 cubic metres, so we're talking about 1,000 times the amount of sand that's in this room. So it's a lot of sand. That would be the initial placement, and then every 5 years, because sand is being lost from this compartment due to long-term effects, you need to come back and place sand. You would place that sand as regularly as it's feasible to place it. I mean, ideally you place it every year, but you don't do that because these projects are quite difficult to mobilise, and practically you come back every 5 years or so and place additional sand. So $7.5 million for your initial placement, and then $11 million for your maintenance nourishment over a 50-year for a massive nourishment project. Clearly big numbers. If we were to consider a groin at Susan Street, now that in itself is a substantial structure. That's a 200-metre long structure, and it needs to be that long because if it's shorter, the sand that we'd like to compartmentalise over here starts to leak and not work for you over here. So it has to go out to a point where you're minimising that loss of sand from the end of the groin. It does the job of a revetment where there's an immediate threat to BNC. So that's what this particular scheme does. It's the same as massive nourishment, but it's limited to 1.2 kilometres of beach north of Susan Street with a quite a substantial groin. What you can see here is you're bringing down your numbers, but they're still substantial numbers. And that's not allowing for the construction of the groin. It's another $5.6 million to construct the groin. And that groin would require 20,000 tonnes of rock. We're talking about substantial structures, bringing in that amount of rock, which you have to do for your revetments. It doesn't matter what rock structure you're talking about, they're substantial quantities of material. Groins you don't see too many of them around. There's some trial groins up on the Sunshine Coast. I can't think off the top of my head where else we might have one. In New South Wales, inside some estuaries we have them. There are some groins in Swansea Channel. There's one up at Noosa. Amenity nourishment is really an adjunct to a revetment. So what this is about, it's about preserving amenity beach width. If you build a revetment at any point on the beach, eventually that beach is going to be lost with sea level rise. So to maintain a beach in front of that wall, you would need to place sand on that beach. Now at the moment we've got about 25 metres of width between your veg line and your mean water line on the beach. Preserving 25 metres just might be luxury if we said, okay, we're prepared to accept a lesser amount. If we prepare to accept a lesser amount, we might need only commence our amenity nourishment in 2034 after the beach has proceeded to that point. And that would then require us to be placing 50,000 cubic metres of sand every 5 years, up to the end of the planning period, which is taken to be 50 years from last year, so up to 2063. $4.4 million. So amenity nourishment doesn't provide full protection to property and assets. It simply gives a suitably wide beach for recreation after walls are built. Problem, where does the sand come from? Where can we get sand for these sorts of projects? There are three possible sources there: commercial, local estuaries, or offshore. Commercial sand costs you about $50 a tonne. If you find the suppliers from Shoalhaven and elsewhere, $75 a cubic metre. If you for that amount of sand for a massive scheme, $40 to $60 million for an end state scheme. Clearly not viable. Local estuaries, the Spurway report talks about potentially 50 to 70,000 cubic metres being released mainly in these large entrance shoal areas, more in Conjola than Currumbeen. Over 50 years still, need 10 times that amount to feed a viable nourishment project at Collingwood. So from throughout the Shoalhaven, what can be released at boat ramps, you know, your estuary entrance bars, is going to be 10, you need 10 times that amount to feed some of your nourishment projects. So again, not viable. Offshore as a source. I mean, there are vast quantities of sand on the inner shelf, about 5 kilometres offshore, 20 to 70 metres. These have been investigated on a number of occasions by others. You can potentially extract those quantities and place them for around about $30 a cubic metre. Still very expensive. You know, you start halving these numbers, you're halving those numbers, you're still talking about lots and lots of money. Another hitch is offshore extraction, in fact, is prohibited in New South Wales under the Offshore Minerals Act 1999. There's so much pressure, though, for sand for these sorts of projects and also for building that it's likely that the state government's going to be reviewing that, in our view, sometime soon. Possibly, you know, related to these stage 2 reforms, who knows. So concluding remarks on dredging. Feasibility of nourishment to provide end state protection is limited by viability of sand sources and cost. Compartment scheme with groin at Susan Street also associated large quantities of sand, plus risks. You know, we're less certain about groin performance. Major approvals issues in the marine park. Amenity nourishment is a valid scheme to either complement end state works, but we still need large quantities of sand, about 3 to 5 times what the estuaries can give us in the Shoalhaven. However, a partial scheme, so we're getting now to our transitional kind of ideas, a partial scheme with similarities to amenity nourishment could possibly achieve a reduction in coastal risk with some tangible benefits. And I'll talk a little bit about that now. Well, in a second. So this was the last of our end state works that we considered, nearshore breakwaters. Nearshore breakwaters are a legitimate form of coastal protection. They have been discussed, as you might know, up at Old Bar. They've been applied on the Gold Coast, but those two applications involve a structure with a crest which is below the waterline. As soon as you have a crest below the waterline, these sorts of structures don't work particularly well. They really need to be emergent. They're detached, they're shore parallel. The sand must be available for them to function. I mean, if there's no sand available in the system, they don't actually work, because you need sand to accumulate there, and that sand's got to come from somewhere. Each structure, we had a look at a possible scheme for Collingwood. Each structure would need to be 200 metres long. We'd have 100-metre gaps between the structures. They'd be located about 200 to 500 metres from the shore. There are some sort of rules of thumb for these types of structures. Clearly would need to be investigated if it was to be pursued. 5 of those structures might be required for precincts B and C. Precinct A, you'd be able to delay that application because of its relative protection. Another 2 might be required down the track, delayed to 2050. Uncertain performance under sea level rise. I mean, these uncertainties are really big problems when it comes to these sorts of structures, because government doesn't want to commit to very large expenditures if it's uncertain how these things are going to perform. And it's fair to say there's a lot of uncertainty with these structures, particularly if the crests of these structures are below the waterline. If they're above the waterline, there are all sorts of other issues. There are amenity issues, major approvals issues, Jervis Bay Marine Park with that sort of structure, I would suggest. Still $28 million for the scheme. So I think we would say not feasible. This is an example, I think, on the Brazilian coast or the South American coast. This is actually Tel Aviv. They've got a whole series of emergent nearshore breakwaters which seem to be working at that site. The end state works report that we prepared looked at all of these options and said, okay, well, what would we suggest as a priority set of projects to deal with the coastal risk at Collingwood Beach? And we developed 5 projects. We weren't particularly mindful of dollars here. What would we do? And what we said we would do is, firstly, we'd relocate the sewage pump station and the mains along the southern end of Elizabeth Drive. And I think here we're talking about pump stations down here and mains down here, getting those away from the shoreline. We'd relocate the mains along the roadheads, Susan, Montague and Berry Streets, pull those back. A revetment to protect Ilfracombe Avenue was our 3rd priority project. Here we've got a road, we've got a water main, and that road is particularly threatened. That road services a lot of property. $4.5 million to construct that. Then we're talking about a revetment to protect all shorefront properties between Susan Street and Albion Street. 900 metre long structure would be our 4th project, $7.9 million. And finally, a revetment to protect shorefront private properties between Holden Street and Susan Street, which would only be required in about 2050. So the present value cost of that structure is actually $3.7 million. And finally, if we build revetments, what we should also be doing is putting sand on the beach to protect the beach. $4.4 million. So clearly lots of money for those schemes. What other ideas might we have? And this is really the challenge. Government's in a bind now. Make good, make safe schemes are in place. They deal with emergencies and minor storms, but they do not manage larger storms or recession. End state schemes have been conceptually described, and at this time we would probably say that they're not feasible and or they're unaffordable. Transitional schemes attempt to bridge these 2 bookends, if you like. Just in general terms, what might transitional schemes embrace? They would want to be adaptive structures. So conceptually you might build for short-term loads and modify if predicted long-term loads eventuate. We have to be careful, obviously, because if we build for short-term loads and we get a mother of all storms and we lose our structure, then we're back to square one. So we have to be very careful how perhaps those sorts of structures might be. And I'll put a few ideas up. Monitoring, we have to monitor. We don't know when to adapt something if we don't monitor. Setting triggers to implement adaptive works, that has to be part of the project. Staging of projects. I mean, we might develop, say, a big scheme, but we should be developing these schemes in stages, starting off with property which is at most risk. Demonstration projects and trials. I think that this is particularly a good idea with sorts of structures that there might be some concern with. For example, offshore breakwaters. For example, groins. There might be ways of building offshore structures, building groins, perhaps not out of rock, or say certainly not out of rock initially, perhaps out of geotextile containers or tubes, seeing if they work. If they work and we satisfy ourselves that there are no untoward impacts, take those away and replace it with rock. But we are talking about our beaches, our environment. We don't want to get it wrong. Demonstration projects and trials, I think, are a good idea. Just transitional arrangements for revetment works. I'll look at a partial revetment layer placement and a partial revetment section placement. So they're 2 different ideas that we could use. This is a layer placement idea, which has actually recently been constructed at Wyong, at Cabbage Tree Harbour, Nora Head. Perhaps you know the site. There's some really threatened properties here. That slope is being destabilised principally by waves biting into the bottom of that bluff, and what this attempts to do is to protect the bottom of the bluff. Now, revetment structures are conventionally built with 2 layers of rock as a minimum. This particular structure is built with 1 layer of armour and 1 layer of underlayer. It has a design life of 15 years, and it's designed to postpone the expenditure of an end state structure, a multi-layer structure. Nonetheless, it still cost $10,000 a metre. And the reason why it cost that much there, I think they had some quite difficult access constraints to get that rock onto the beach. In fact, if you go through the sums here, this rock is placed for around about $500 a tonne. Now, $500 a tonne is quite a very high placement cost for a revetment, and I think it was mainly related to the access. But I just put this up as a concept for a transitional scheme. It's designed to have a short life, and it's designed to delay an expenditure of an end state scheme. We would be a little bit concerned about this scheme because of the uncertainty that resides with a single layer structure. I mean, if that's hit by a design storm, potentially you could lose that whole structure. So I'm not sure we would be suggesting that. One other idea which might be worth looking at is this is a conventional type of revetment. Nonetheless, what we've shown for Collingwood might not have a toe, but the concept is valid. If that structure wasn't there and we had a storm, we might lose material back to, say, that point, which, if you like, is a hazard line. That your zone of reduced foundation capacity hazard line might be there, but your zone of slope adjustment hazard line might be there. So it's effectively a hazard line. If we built perhaps part of that structure and we satisfied ourselves that that part of the structure wouldn't get washed away, so that's obviously important, as a stage 1 to a full project, what we can actually show theoretically is that just by building that hazard line can actually be moved from there to there. So there's potentially a staged implementation of a wall which might take a hazard line away from harm's way from some buildings. If in the future we find that sea levels start to rise and that the hazard is increasing and we need to respond, we then might finish that wall. So that is an idea. Nonetheless, just to go out there and to build that would still cost a substantial amount of money. You still have to go out there, you have to dig a hole, you're placing this material down 2 metres or 1.5 metres below mean sea level. There's dewatering to deal with. It is an expensive part of the structure. To prove that up, you would have to physically model it. You would have to demonstrate that by building that, you got that benefit, and by building that and exposing it to severe storms, you weren't washing out the back of that structure. So those are ideas just to deal with revetment structures. Backpass nourishment is an idea that I'll just bring to you because there is potentially an application, I think, at Collingwood. What backpass nourishment is, it's about taking sand that, after it's eroded from your beach, goes to a certain point, bringing it back to your beach. So simply taking it from its destination and bringing it back to the beach. Now, this is done at a few beaches, Corrowarnarrabeen, Jimmy's Beach and Noosa, and I'll quickly go through those. At Corrowarnarrabeen, what they do is they remove sand from the entrance to Narrabeen Lagoon about once every 3 to 5 years or so, and they truck the sand around through roadheads and they put it on the beach. And that sand then works its way naturally back to the entrance and refills the entrance. They relocate about 15 to 20,000 cubic metres of sand. Sorry, should have cubic metre there. Cubic metres of sand on average, and the cost to do that is about $22 a cubic metre. Now, they've been doing that for about 30 years or so. these quantities here are not going to help you. They're not going to protect you in a storm. They're going to assist. They're going to reduce your exposure, but they're not going to fully protect you. So that's the thing to bear in mind. That's the case at Corro and Narrabeen. That's placing at the roadhead, so you can imagine something like that perhaps being done from some of your roadheads. At Jimmy's Beach, what we have at Jimmy's Beach, we've got about 500 metres or so of shoreline, which is very exposed. There is a road between the beach and the properties, a bit like Ilfracombe Avenue. What council does there is it takes sand from Yakaba and it puts it back on the beach. And that sand is then a road from the beach and it goes back to Yakaba. So the idea is to set up a sustainable loop. The difference between this site and Corro and Narrabeen and also Noosa, which I'll show you, is that this scheme here actually provides end-state protection for Jimmy's Beach. The quantities of sand that are replaced in Jimmy's Beach actually feeds erosion in a design storm, and it feeds recession. So it's an end-state scheme for Jimmy's Beach. At Jimmy's Beach, they've installed a permanent pipeline, and they use a cutter suction dredge at the Yakaba Borrow site. At Noosa Heads, some of you might have been there. That's Hastings Street. It's the entrance to the Noosa River. An old seawall was built here in 1968. A groin was constructed there in 1982. This is a very high value benefit shoreline. An amenity beach is required for a lot of those businesses to survive. What they set up at Noosa is they set up a backpass scheme at Noosa which took sand from a destination area and took it back to that eastern end of the beach. The scheme here is called a slurry system scheme. There are intakes below the sand in the swash zone there that sucks sand in, and that sand is pumped along the shoreline to an outlet, and that outlet dribbles onto the beach, and the sand finds its way eventually back to those intakes. The benefit for Noosa, as demonstrated in a trial, they trialled that for I think about 4 years or so before they built their permanent scheme. So again, I guess an adaptive idea. A lot of sand shown on the beach when that was implemented. Before implementation, not very much sand. Just a quick one of the pump station at that end and what the outlet looks like at that end. So you can see you don't see too much, but quite an expensive scheme anyway. Transitional schemes for Collingwood. A recommended Category 1 project is to protect Ilfracombe Avenue with a revetment. Examine a transitional scheme, a buried tow perhaps for that. If the coastal threat increases, what could we maybe do? We could look at a backpass scheme at Collingwood out of Moona. Now, clearly this would need to be investigated to make sure that it was sustainable, but it's possible that if we had, say, a transitional revetment scheme operating at Ilfracombe, and we had some sort of a backpass scheme working from Moona, in combination, they might assist you either from Albion, or we could even take it back up to Susan with that. Feasibility depends on the quantity of sand that can be sustainably removed from the creek entrance, and clearly the ecological assessments and Jervis Bay Marine Park approvals that would need to be done. I mean, just having a look at two of the early photos, a closer look at, say, that entrance, this is the position of the bridge here. It seems that there's quite a lot more sand perhaps here in 2011 than there is in 1944. But Really, we haven't investigated that. I've just sort of pulled up two photos there and compared them. So where to from here? For Collingwood Beach, we've done our DCP work. We didn't find any resistant material. Nonetheless, bedrock investigations, I think, are warranted at all of these beaches just because of the implications of these lines. Here we're talking about actually drilling holes, perhaps at your road heads, even along your cycleway path, and confirming that we don't find anything along the beach. We can investigate the sustainability of sand recycling, say from Moona Moona. Is there enough sand to reduce coastal erosion risk? Can it be borrowed? Ecological implications, approvals, requirements. Partial placement of a revetment. Physical modelling would be a certain requirement. A risk-based assessment of coastal hazard lines. This is an idea which is only now, I guess, being considered. At Coronarabine it's been done. It's also been done at Albar. It's fair to say it's not a panacea. It's about looking at the likelihood of actually getting erosion to points and considering the consequences of that and assessing that likelihood and consequence in a risk context. And it's borrowing a methodology that geotechnical engineers have developed for landslide risk. It's been developed at Coronarabine. There are a lot of hairs still on the scheme, and it really is a work in progress. But that's something that I believe the state government is thinking about as part of its stage 2 reforms. A trigger-based action plan and a review of emergency sub-plan are also things that we need to do at Collingwood. Thank you very much.